session is being recorded, so you will be able to get access to that or share it with people afterwards if you wish. It'll be on our covid.immune.org.nz website probably sometime tomorrow. The Q&A function will be available for you to ask questions, which we'll manage as we go along, and the chat function will be disabled. Great. So Nikki, would you like to take it away?
Kia ora koutou, and thanks, Theo. So Theo, are you going to bring up the slides?
Sorry, I will do the slides.
So I'm just going to start with making a few comments first, because as we're all very aware, particularly in the last few weeks, the environment has changed considerably for many of us. And I just wanted to share both the pain and the extraordinary environment we're in with everybody. And firstly, one of the things that when it feels hard at the moment is the important thing to remember is that New Zealand's actually getting incredibly high vaccination rates for COVID. We're doing better than most Western countries. So even though it's feeling really hard at the moment, the reason it's getting hard is that we've really vaccinated the vast majority of the population who can be vaccinated, and it gets harder and harder as you're getting to the group of people who, for a whole lot of reasons, have got barriers to getting vaccinated. So traditionally, we would have had a few of these people amongst the usual mixture, and now it just seems like it's a lot harder. And that's just a numbers game because we've got so many people vaccinated now, and we're doing our best to vaccinate as many as possible. It's getting challenging. And the other challenging issue that New Zealand's never had before is this new occupational mandatory situation, and also the government's decisions around needing vaccination certificates in a lot of social events is really pushing the pace in a way it never has before. And the risk for all of us is we're now getting a very high risk of polarization. So we're seeing angry people, people not feeling heard, people who feel pushed into a corner. So that is also making our conversations a lot harder. And also, so what we're looking at now is the people who at this point have not yet been vaccinated in a whole lot of different ways are going to need a lot more support to either get across the line or to decide they're going to continue with their stance. Now, the key things we've always known, and everybody knows this, is people need a trusted source. So if the person you're communicating with doesn't feel that they can trust you, then we're not really going to get past the first point. So the first thing is developing a trusting relationship. And if we can't develop a trusting relationship, we really need to find a different way where people can engage somewhere where they feel it might be more trusted. I think the other thing to recognize for all of us now is the extra time and resourcing commitment this is now taking. These are not quick 2-minute conversations anymore. These are not conversations we can just build in the rest of our GP consult time or our nurse consult time. These require significant effort and thought and often repeated engagement, sometimes just to build up trust and to allow people to talk and express themselves. So for all of us, recognizing the extra time and resourcing commitment. And the next thing I want to say is the sense of fatigue and exhaustion we've all got at the moment. If you've done a few of these conversations in one day, it's really, really tiring. To keep up the sense of compassion for someone who has a very different viewpoint from ourselves, who's for somebody whose understanding of science is so removed from our understanding, who comes with quite a different worldview, it's really very tiring. So just to look after ourselves and recognize a lot of compassion fatigue going on for all of us at the moment. We will not be able to get everybody vaccinated, and that is okay. We just do our best. So I want to acknowledge the conversations are tiring. I want to say when you hit anger or opposition or no engagement point, that's okay. We use courtesy, we use politeness, we give ourselves permission to disengage from the conversation when we've been as courteous and polite and as warm and compassionate as possible. What people want delivery of is reassurance, not facts. It's so easy to get bogged down in facts at the moment. Don't get bogged down in details and endless questions. Some people will just keep firing questions at you. And in the end, we need to step back from the multitudinous questions and look at what is the bigger issue overall. Try and stick to the bigger picture. Try and stick to the question above the question, which is, why do you need to be vaccinated? Are you at risk of disease? And try and keep it at that level. I would write down people's specific concerns, so you've got a list of them, and then deal with that, but not keep relitigating and relitigating and relitigating, people will tend to just come with more and more and more questions. So it's quite good just to start with a list at the start and say, right, let me see what the questions are and get them down clearly. I think what we need to do in our role is to try and deliver an understanding, not of he says, this piece says this piece says this, but the overall picture that there is a body of science, a body of experts over and above all these nitpicking little points. That is what collects the science. It's not a single study. It's not a single expert, not a single so-called expert. It's a body of science from the International World Health Organization collection of body, the peer-reviewed literature down, and it's not about a single study. So getting caught in a tit for tat is not helpful, and cherry-picking articles like people are often doing at the moment. So I wanted to talk about, firstly, about the general principles. So Theo, if you wouldn't mind moving to the first slide, thanks. Yeah, so overall, this is really useful in my head. When you've got somebody that you feel really exhausted with, think about the bigger picture for that person. Why does somebody get a vaccination? And it's not just about whether they've read the right source or not. It's all the different bigger model. So step back and look at the different bigger model for why this person thinks and feels what they do. They'll have their own variant of a risk-benefit ratio in their heads about themselves, about their families, alongside what they've read and what they perceive they understand. Alongside that, it's the social processes. Is it normal within their social environment? You know, do they come from a strong social environment which just doesn't agree or support the science? Or do they genuinely have a few real concerns that you can address? You know, do they have trust in us? What is their self-confidence in answering questions? What are the norms around them? The norms are shifting at the moment in New Zealand. I mean, I don't think we've ever got nearly 90% coverage for an adult vaccination ever before. So that'll make adult vaccination way more normalized than it has been in the past. And that'll shift things across the board to essentially this is what this country does. You know, there will be a small group of people outside it, but this is essentially what this country is now doing. Now, those all build together to make motivation. And then we all know about the practical issues. You know, is it easy for the person to get the vaccination? Have we made it easy? Is the vaccination experience not too scary? Don't forget needle phobia. Huge amount of people out there are really, really scared of needles. And think about all the strategies we've got around supporting people whose underlying issue is actually really fear of needles. Now, just for a few minutes, I wanted to go over a few general principles. Now, these principles are based on a distillation of some extensive work done from the workshop, Jess Berenson and team, an extensive evidence-based work around what are the most useful strategies for a conversation. And we've distilled them into these 6 key points. Now, a lot of them, for many of you who are out there day in, day out communicating, a lot of these are a bit like telling us how to suck eggs, but they're just really important for us in terms of how we frame our conversations. And I particularly have to say, for me, late on a Friday afternoon when I'm tired in general practice, and I've had many conversations, some of which haven't gone well, remembering to go back to these principles, I think is really helpful. So I've just got 6 to rush through. So Theo, if you want to go to the first one, the first starting point for a conversation is assuming people are willing to get vaccinated. That's our stance, that's our principle. So we're assuming the person is interested in being vaccinated. They're looking for reassurance, they're looking for information or support. And we mustn't make assumptions about where their lack of surety comes from, and try and keep in mind that first slide that there's a whole lot of complex reasons for why somebody may take their time to decide. So that's the first one. The second one, thanks Theo, is the whole question around trust. Now, we all know that as health service providers, that the aim of the game is to develop a trusting relationship. That's ultimately the aim above everything else. If we have a trusting relationship, we can communicate. If we don't, it's an uphill battle. Now, if you really feel, sometimes it takes multiple engagement points to develop a trusting relationship, and you don't have to charge in and solve it all at once. Sometimes we're the wrong person for the trusting relationship, and that person may need someone else who fits their worldview, their world background, maybe their cultural background better than I may do. So sometimes just acknowledging I may not be the right person for this conversation. Is there someone else who would be more useful for them? And the other recognition is acts of trust and loss of trust is often about previous negative experiences. So people who have had hard and difficult experiences in the past, and of course in the Māori worldview, a lot of this is about the historical problems with Māori and dispossession, and in a worldview of people who things have gone wrong in the health service for themselves or their family, that's where a lot of it comes from. And sometimes they just need to talk through those issues, maybe with people they trust. So moving to the third point. So when we've got past that point and we've got an engaged relationship, what we tend to do, and I think we do this naturally anyway, is you ask. So you ask people to share their thoughts and show them that you are listening without judgment. So at this point, it's sometimes quite helpful to even maybe jot down the key points and concerns they've got, or reflect them back to them so that they feel that those are the key issues that they have and you've heard them. Once you feel like you've got the issues established, then you can respond to the key issues and talk to those ones specifically. And then after those, go back and say, does that make sense to you? And how do you feel about that? Now, I would not keep asking. I ask once, you establish the key questions, you respond to those. If you do get people that come back and back and back, you have to reflect that I've responded to your key concerns, because otherwise you do get into this tangle of endless tit-for-tat. So if we move to the next point, so I think this point is really key, and I've been trying to practice this a lot now, is leading with values before evidence. So, you know, the reason we are vaccinating, the value to this, the value to me, to my family, to my community. It's about caring, it's about loving. The reason we're really pushing this vaccination is not because the government's telling you, and not because you're about to lose your job, but as a community, we want to protect our community, our elderly members of our community, our family members. Many of us are at high risk of this disease. That's the value. It's the cake, the overall picture that we're trying to sell here, and not get caught in the tin tax here. Talk personally about why vaccination matters to you. I have elderly parents. I'm looking after them. I do not want to carry COVID to my parents. I don't want them to die of COVID. Many people will have children, adults recovering from cancer, people with severe immune system problems. We want to protect our community, and we want ourselves to stay safe. You know, I'm a frontline GP. I'm scared of catching COVID. I want to stay safe. Many of us, you know, drawing upon the best values of the New Zealand community, want to look after the vulnerable people in our community. You can call upon that for everybody. I know you want to care for your family. So do I. This is the best way, the best tool. We have to do that alongside other tools. And so if you talk about how you want to do it too, it creates that point of connection of us as caring, sharing individuals between ourselves. So the next point, thanks, Theo, is and trying to use plain language and effective metaphors. Now, we do this anyway. We do our consults day in, day out. So this is telling us to suck eggs, but actually I've learned that I have to practice it, that I often have to practice the way I say things. It comes out wrong. I repeat it. I have to learn how to pitch what I'm saying. So sometimes this needs a bit of practice. So in my head, I'm creating sound bites where I'm practicing, how does this sound? Does this make sense? And trying it again. And I do think we need to practice plain language. Certainly if we read too many scientific journals or we talk to ourselves too much, our language gets quite convoluted. So I think practicing the use of plain language is very useful. And so I know that a lot of our registrars do role playing. I think it's very useful for those of us sometimes videoing our consults and seeing how we hear ourselves and come across. These are really useful tools in helping us improve our language. I don't have the answers for us, but all I know is that we need to keep practicing and tuning in our language to make it appropriate for the listener. And so the next one, thanks, Theo. So the other important point, and the final important point, is we recommend vaccination. We are clear about the science, the evidence base behind vaccination. We recommend vaccination. And that ultimately is what we're after. The person is entitled not to be vaccinated. That is absolutely their entitlement and their choice. But as a health professional with the bulk of the scientific evidence-based knowledge behind me, it would be unethical of me not to recommend vaccination. So long as we treat people respectfully, recognise and acknowledge their concerns, and share the values that they may well choose to vaccinate. And if not today, then maybe in the future. And so the dialogue can continue and we don't need to shut down the dialogue. So those were the key points I was going to finish with. And we just move on to the last slide. And I wondered, I might even just pass back to Theo briefly, just to mention briefly the resources available through IMAC to help us through this really difficult time. But just before I say that, I do want to say, don't forget how incredibly well we've done so far and how good our vaccination rates are to date compared to many other countries. And yes, we have COVID in New Zealand, but I would reflect that we've got way less COVID than I would have expected at this point. And a large reason for that is because the vaccination rates are getting high. So I'm going to just pass back over to Theo. You want to make a few comments about information and support?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. So obviously we do have our covid.immune.org.nz website, which you may have found by now. And if you go to the written resources page, I've just this afternoon created a tag called communication. So if you click on the communication kind of button up the top, that'll filter and just show you the sort of the essential resources that we've got on our site, which includes that handout that Nikki's been demonstrating to you. Also the workshop, Jess's organisation has an extensive list of resources which are linked from that page as well, I believe. If they're not, which I'm pretty sure they are, I'll double check that and you can get them from there as well. Obviously, when you're in conversation with, if you've got consumers and you've got questions at the time, clinical questions that kind of need answering and you're a little bit unclear, you do have the option of ringing 0800 Immune and getting through. Just follow the prompts and we can generally answer questions on the fly like that. And we of course do have online learning opportunities around the COVID vaccine for the vaccinators, which you've probably already seen at lms.immune.org.nz. So that's kind of the basics of what we've got here. There's the ministry also has quite a few resources that are worth checking out. They've got a lot of animations now, as we've got some animations on our video page as well to explain some basics around how the vaccine is made and how we sort of judge its safety profile, which is worth sharing. But they're at a very high level, which I think is appropriate. We're not delving into the great detail. I think, as Nikki said, when those conversations if you're getting into a bit of a fact off with people, that becomes unhelpful. So just keeping it at that level of building trust with people and relating to them and sharing how your own experience and belief systems can be very, very beneficial. So what I'll do now is I'm going to stop sharing, and Jess, I'll pass on to you. Thank you. So Jess Berenston-Shaw.
Oh, kia ora, thank you. I think Nikki covered everything really nicely. So I'm going to be really quick and we're just going to move on to Q&A, I think, for most people. But I'm just going to share my screen and do a really kind of high-level overview of some of the additional things from, excuse me while I fiddle. I need like an Alison Holst pre-prepared bit here. Nikki talked really clearly about what drives vaccination hesitations, which are complex. I think we have a media environment at the moment which does suggest to us that it's all about false information, but I just really want to emphasize that false information does play a role, but proponents of it are simply exploiting existing issues that have caused a lot of distrust for people. And so the solution is not necessarily to just deal straight with the false information, even though that's our default kind of nature of wanting to address it. And addressing those underlying drivers is going to be long-term work. but our communications in the short term can address some of the concerns. And I want to say at this point that especially in offline conversations, so the conversations you are having in real life with people on the phone, in person, are where I guess the pedal hits the metal at this point, because it is, as Nikki said, almost impossible for us to deal with the enormous tsunami of false information that's being driven at people. It's incredibly resource intensive to try and do it all online. And there is enormous power in connecting with people in a one-on-one scenario. So if we can do these conversations well over time with people, I think that we'll get there for the majority of people. Really important that, and I'm telling you all how to do your job here, but really these conversations are about meeting people's emotional needs. I think we are in an environment we feel like we need to provide a lot of facts for people, but the first thing that we know from the research in these conversations is if you can meet people's emotional needs, you're much more likely to get them into a space where they're willing to hear the reassuring and accurate information. And we know from our own research and testing with people, they feel vastly more reassured when we talk about the care, for example, within the health system for them and their well-being, than if we provide them with facts. We often talk about the "how would you rather die" message really goes down very badly with people. So that's where you say you've got more chance of being hit by a bus or dying of COVID than you have of dying of a vaccination. And that's because what people really need is to have their emotional needs met. And to talk, one of the ways we can talk about that is, again, to talk about the care that people within the health system have, and to point to people who they're trusted with. And just emphasizing what Nikki said, there aren't going to be many quick wins now. We really have got to the point where those people who were enthusiastic enough or only slightly hesitant have got over the line. And now it's just really the hard work of long-term conversations with people. So there will be burnout. You will get tired. It is important to tap out. What I want to show you here actually is just from a guide that we've done recently, which is about much more about personal conversations, but it proved quite useful to think about the types of scenarios that you might get into. And although people do not fall neatly into 3 categories, it's useful to think about the types of responses that you might get. And I just wanted to reflect, Nikki's done a really good job of just talking about what is a listening space look and sound like. So I'm just going to talk about the 2 extreme arms briefly. One of the things that it's really important, I've just noticed a typo on that actually, but anyway, one of the things that's really important to do is for people who are already vaccinated, what we can do is spend some time encouraging them to tell their stories to other people, because actually they will be trusted to other people. And so if you know people who have got 1 vaccination perhaps, or perhaps you're finding people who had concerns and move themselves over the line, really encourage them to tell their friends about what helped them move on over the line. Maybe it's on social media, maybe it's in person, but these are our vaccine champions now. The people who were hesitant or had concerns and got vaccinations, they're going to help us in this work. So really encourage them. On the far side, we've got a pathway for what happens when you meet people who are highly oppositional to vaccination, and increasingly you will, as Nikki said, see more of these people, and you'll be having more of these conversations with people. Just want to say to you, you can decide to engage or not engage. That is totally up to you. If you decide to engage, going through the ask, share, ask process is very helpful. Again, not getting into fact offs. If you decide not to engage, you don't need to let false information lie. We can continue to say why it matters for us. We have got a little box there about for people who have to make hard decisions about whether they are going to have vaccinated, unvaccinated people in their life. That doesn't apply so much. Really important that you end the conversation quickly if it's going south. You do not want to get into fights with people. You want to keep the conversation open. As people in healthcare, you potentially are going to be the one person these people continue to have contact with if they are ideologically opposed. And it's really good, we know from the research, if people are strongly opposed to vaccine, that there are some people in their life still who they can have a conversation with should they start to waver, but especially if they're in, for example, an online echo chamber. So think about what the long-term relationship in that space is. Again, as Nikki said, it's a little bit like voting behaviour, vaccination behaviour. People are much more likely to vote or get vaccinated if you ask them at the end of your conversation if they are willing to get vaccinated. Will you get vaccinated? That can be relatively uncomfortable sometimes if you've had a difficult conversation. But again, practice that, because it does actually have an impact on people's, when they make a commitment to somebody else that they're going to get vaccinated, they're much more likely to do it in the same way that they will vote. So you can have a read of that. I'll pop a link to the longer guide of this. And again, Theo said there's a link hopefully on the IMAC website, so you can spend more time looking at that. But I just wanted to, and I did notice that one of the Q&As in there had this. Look, we do know from our own research, and you would have seen it a lot, that there are very strong narratives around choice and freedom being enacted for rejecting vaccination, individual choice and freedom. So for partly this reason, we suggest at this stage that you avoid using this term, it's your choice, and instead you pivot to something which is probably closer to what we're actually meaning to people, which is that we want them to have their concerns addressed and that we understand that. Because that is one slightly easier way that we can avoid kind of falling down that that hole into a choice and freedom conversation. And it's much more about how can we address your concerns. Instead of the facts are starting a conversation with my understanding of the body of research or my understanding of the science. Instead of appealing to expertise, we do know at this point you've probably got a group of people who have very low trust in traditional experts. Then we can pivot to talking about the care that people giving vaccinations, or the care that you have, and why you want to get them to get vaccinated. So again, moving very much away from this appeal to expertise and science and much more into the care space. And again, instead of asking people why they won't get vaccinated, if we assume that people are willing but they're having difficulty getting there, ask them what they need to feel reassured enough to get vaccinated. Those are just some little short kind of tips and scripts that we've found are useful when you're having these conversations that you can rely on. I've met my 4:30 deadline, so I'm going to stop sharing and go to questions now, I think, because I think that's going to be the more useful space for this.
Thanks very much, Jess. Greatly appreciated. Nikki, do you want to unmute yourself? And I might just switch to gallery view now for everybody, if that's going to work. It says it is, but it's not. So we'll just go to questions now. Jenny was wondering if we could just clarify the vaccine. I mean, there are some technical questions here that are not so related to conversations. So I think we're happy to answer those as well.
Yeah.
Just clarifying vaccine RNA interface with cells and its frequent, as it's a frequent concern.
Yeah.
And what is the research sources to quote?
So firstly, I mean, do use our website if you can, and we are trying to get it as organised as well as we can, but we do have little summaries of what RNA is, how RNA vaccine works, you know, and its safety profile. So my first is, you know, reputable websites, and I hope people would feel that in that website, because it's University of Auckland, it's World Health Organization endorsed as a good science website. So, I mean, I think the quick, short communication messages around RNA is it's a messenger. It's not a piece of genetic material that gets inside the nucleus. So it cannot affect the genome of who you are. The RNA is a messenger that when it's given into the body makes the protein. It's coded for the protein, the spike protein on the outside of the COVID virus, the coronavirus COVID. So the RNA is essentially the recipe that the body recognizes and makes the protein. And it's the protein that you have the immune response to. So that's the way I simply say it. And it's got nothing to do with my own genetic material. It cannot affect who I am or what I am. So it's got no potential to change the genetic makeup of me.
Thank you for that. Nape was just mentioning, which I think we've sort of touched on, is that it's also about making full use of social workers and health coordinators to liaise between the clinician and the patient and vice versa. So maybe just
so
talking
kia
a bit
ora,
about that.
Nape. I just want to say thank you so much for bringing that up. That you know, we aren't just nurses and doctors here. We are a rich health sector and allied health sector. And the point about who is the trusted person for people to talk to, it's a really, really important point. So thank you so much. Just think about all the ability of our coordinators, our social workers, all our other people. Our pharmacists are amazing in their communications. There's a whole lot of people rich and diverse out there in our health sector that can help with the communicating conversations. And now more than ever, we need everybody to work with our communities to really get the conversations going.
Thanks. And then Michael, Jess, Michael was asking about that. He's sort of seeing a lot of vaccinated people experiencing increased stress around their conversations with their vaccine hesitant family. And if you've got any advice on how to support them with their conversations.
Yeah, it's super hard right now because I think you're getting into this space where people are having to make decisions about whether they're going to be around vaccinated, unvaccinated people. I mean, the first thing I think there is this tricky place where you have to decide whether you are the right person to have that conversation. And one of the things I said in a previous talk that I gave is that sometimes when there's a deep relationship and maybe there's other complexities involved, you know, historical hurts or, you know, all of the stuff that goes down in families, sometimes you might not be the right people to have a vaccination conversation. And so I guess I want to give people permission to not have that conversation, to perhaps decide initially that you're not going to be, or this Christmas or whatever, you're not going to be around people who are unvaccinated. We've got some guidance in that family and conversations guide about how you can have that tricky conversation. Decide before you have the conversation about why it matters to you that you're not around unvaccinated people. Let people know that that's your decision. Don't litigate it with them. Don't make it about them. Don't say that you're judging them. It's just something that you need to do, and ask that you keep in contact in other ways. I'm not saying it's easy by any chance. I think if you're willing to engage in a conversation about getting vaccinated with those people, you feel like you are the right person to have the conversation, then you can follow the ask, share, ask model that Nikki's talked about as well. It works just as well in our interpersonal relationships if we think that we can manage it. But I would say that possibly what I'm seeing is a lot of families get into really bitter facts-offs over social media. I would 100% advise, if you can, do not have these conversations in a digital space. It leaves you wide open for misinterpretation, anger, and hurt. Try and have them, if you can, over a phone call or at least Zoom if you're still in lockdown. But yeah, again, keeping them short, not keeping them going, stating your position, stating why you care and you'd like to see them vaccinated, but that you understand they haven't had their concerns met, and then just exiting. There are going to be some bitter recriminations, but I think if we can learn to exit early, then over time, hopefully those might heal.
Another question for you, Jess, on the workshop pathway on deciding whether to engage or not, who decides? Is it the patient or the clinician or both?
Well, look, it's a bit of both, really. I mean, if you are the person who wants to have a conversation about getting vaccinated, then you have to make a decision about whether, for example, as Nikki said, if it's a Friday afternoon and you've had 20 conversations and you're exhausted and you're feeling that sense of anger, I would suggest that you're deciding that this is not the best place to engage in a conversation. So it's as much about how much can you meet people's emotional needs at that point, because you're going to have to meet their emotional needs, and do you have it within you? So that's a good part of it. And then I guess it is about that person. Are they giving you signs that they do not wish to have this conversation, in which case you need to respect that. Yeah.
And then Rebecca wanted to know about how to manage people who come in for vaccination but are hostile with the vaccinator.
Nikki, why don't you?
I
There's a bit
think
of
it's
some
like
health and safety stuff in that too.
this is health and safety. And if you think about your
Mm.
own clinical environment, and I just speak from my own general practice, some of our people come in and they might be drunk, or they might be thought disordered from mental illness, or they might have got confused and take the anger out on us. So this is a common problem within our sort of work environment. We need to be sure about our own barriers and our own safety. So we offer our services, but we have very clear parameters about the safety of our services. I've noticed in my own practice that people are respectful to me because I'm a doctor, so you have to be nice. And they're rude as hell sometimes to our administrator, and that is unacceptable. So human respect needs to remain. We need to recognize that people do get confused, they get mixed up, they can get a whole lot of things mixed up. And so there are simple techniques of diffusing anger, like not meeting people's eye, calming down, not standing over them, stepping back, giving people space to allow themselves to calm down. Those simple diffusion techniques that many people who've worked in the mental health space will be familiar with, they're actually useful to be aware of, and they often diffuse tension. If you've got through that and you've still got an angry, aggressive person, then you absolutely have the right. It's like getting yourself out of a conversation. You can get yourself out of the physical environment and say, until you calm down and we can have a respectful interaction, I'm going to leave the room. And, having worked in many environments and myself in the past, I've taken on many angles of these skills that we need staff and support around us so that we're not abused, but we do recognize that people lash out in their confusion in all sorts of strange ways. So keep our boundaries and our clarity, but just know some of the standard diffusion points. Sometimes you might just say the wrong thing and it flares somebody up. So just recognizing that and simple diffusion approaches. So I hope that helps a bit. There's a whole dialogue around how to manage this. There's just a few little points that I've learned over the years, and you never get it fully right either. There's no single answer here.
It's also, Cornelia's mentioned that she doesn't talk about side effects, but chooses to talk about reactions, which makes them feel better. It seems that a lot of people find that side effects sounds a bit scary.
I think that's a very useful and sensible word. And that's, again, about learning the language that works for people. And I think that's really wise.
And so just wanting clarification around how long immunity lasts following second dose. And if you can advise when frontline workers and patients who have had their second dose over 6 months ago may be able to have another dose. So this is the question around
about boosters.
When are the booster doses coming, which were announced today, as you know?
Right. So booster doses are coming. So we do know that vaccine immunity wanes. Now, antibody levels do start to wane from 6 months onwards. Cellular memory lasts longer. So, and then we've got to remember that everybody's different, and immunity wanes quicker for some than others, particularly for elderly people. People of my mature years and older have less of an immune response than those young, fit, vigorous immune systems, that horrendous word immunosenescence. So it's not the same for everybody. So we do know there's waning immunity. We do know that we do need boosters. It's going to be announced in New Zealand very soon. We're expecting to be able to get access to boosters. We don't know when, but in the reasonably, I would hope this year anyway. And the first line who will be expected to be offered will be certainly all the frontline healthcare services, because we're at the front line of being exposed to COVID. And then it's likely to be offered to all adults, but obviously older adults, not younger. Younger people do not need a vaccine booster so quickly. And then remembering the very elderly, people with significant medical problems, and then Māori and Pacifica people, are likely to be at risk of COVID younger. So we're expecting to hear it soon. The announcement would likely say from 6 months after your vaccination course, but remembering there's priority groups that you think about first, and that would certainly be frontline healthcare providers in the priority groups. It's a long question. It's not that straightforward, but boosters, at least a one-off booster is what we expect to have. After that, we don't know how long immunity will last, particularly with younger people. It might last a very long time. So this doesn't mean that we're going to need boosters every year. We'll just have to wait and see.
Someone else has mentioned that they've had a patient of theirs who's 50 years old, a 50-year-old male who's unvaccinated, who went on the online risk calculator to help with vaccine discussions. It's an Australian risk calculator. And so he basically worked out that his risk of catching COVID-19 over a 6-month period is 5%, based on this calculator, even in a high transmission environment. So the person posing the question is wondering if that's correct, although I would probably hazard it's getting into a bit of a fact off at this point.
So just a few points about those sort of things. There's a lot of variables, not a single variable. So the amount of immunisation coverage in the environment would make a difference to your risk, but we're not going to say to people, don't get coverage, because you're then just leveraging off someone else. So the first thing is, the higher the immunisation coverage, the lower your risk, but that's a reason to be vaccinated. So if you're completely no immunisation coverage, then your risk is much higher. And then if you've got a 5% risk, that's actually a relatively high risk for a nasty disease. If it's a 5% risk of a mild disease, it's fine. But if it's a 5% risk of a nasty disease, it's not that fine. And particularly when you can also spread it to others. So there's a lot of different facts. So I haven't seen that calculator, but I think it's too linear, and it's not considering all the different aspects of how you protect the community, not just you as an individual.
Yeah,
and once again, back to community protection.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Nikki. Sure. I think, because one of the things that we've found is that the reason why there's generally a low understanding of how immunisation works across communities is because we have primarily had a lot of vaccination conversations from an individual risk and benefit perspective in the past. And, you know, there's a lot of risk benefit charts available for people, and these are how we've traditionally had those conversations. And what we've seen in the research is that's tended to undermine people's understanding of how important collective immunity is. And so as much as we can, we talk about not just protection to the individual, but actually the protection that is conferred to people through collective immunity. And as much as you can talk about, for example, when most of us are vaccinated, it actually keeps COVID out, and that's where the protection comes. It doesn't just come from our own individual immunity when exposed to COVID. It comes from the fact that we can actually shield most of the population from COVID or its variants. So as much as you can, try and lift that conversation up to these kind of these wider conversations about how immunity actually works across the collective.
Lovely. And we lost Theo.
Sorry, I was muted.
Bingo.
Yeah. Here we go. Patients have got a patient, or someone's got a patient who is concerned about the spike protein being expressed in the cell wall and potentially causing long-term health problems until the cell is turned over. Is that true?
I think, once again, if you lift this up to the bigger question, the question is, how does the vaccine work? And I think once you've presented your recipe to the body is responding to that RNA in the same way it would respond to the virus. So your body is doing what it normally does and what it's trained to do. So it's a completely normal process. The body is making a protein, which is recognized as the foreigner, and then the body's immune system is responding to that foreign shape. That's exactly what immune systems are meant to do. It does it, a piece of protein is removed by the immune system and it's gone. And it's gone within hours, possibly within days. So that is what our bodies are designed to do. So it's doing exactly what it's designed to do. And so if you want to be concerned about your body's immune system, then you're missing the point of how an immune system works.
Yeah, and then
I'm sure there's a better way of framing that, by the way. Everyone can practice in sound bites on that one. It's a natural response. Once you've given the genetic material that the body responds to, it's a natural response. And that's, I think, the bigger response, which I quite like.
And then someone was asking, how do we reassure someone that it won't cause cancer in the long term in reference to MedSafe data sheet? So I think this is a good point about what a data sheet is and what it isn't, and that it's not clinical advice. So
yeah. Well, firstly, there was no need to do genotoxicity or carcinogenicity studies because there was no biological plausibility of why that would be a concern. So it wasn't needed. Remembering that we're not manipulating genes here, there's no genetic problems going on. So this is back to that original point about what an RNA vaccine is. It's not messing with the genetic materials. So if there was any carcinogenic potential of COVID, then we're going to see it with wild COVID. So if you're worried about cancer, then I think you should be very worried about the amount of COVID that the world has just got. Because if this is a virus that eventually can mutate into a cancer, then the world's got a real problem. There's no sign of it yet, and there's certainly no sign of it within vaccines.
Great. I'm just seeing if there's a few more specifics here. Just from, I wasn't at the webinar yesterday about the third dose, Nikki. I don't know if you were.
No.
But can you quickly outline the 2 documents needed for third dose
Sure.
in immunocompromised? Does a
Yeah,
letter
so-
suffice? And can a pharmacist initiate the prescription?
Right,
And
so the
what
problem,
updated
oh,
consent?
sorry, Theo. So the problem for the third dose for the highly immunocompromised is it's not yet got through MedSafe approval. So it requires an authorized medical practitioner, general practitioner or nurse practitioner to write a script. And that means that the GP or the nurse practitioner prints out a script just from your printing out any old script. You print the community vaccine and print it out, you hand it to the patient. Alongside the script, it's recommended that you work through and sign an informed consent form. Once the patient's got the script and the informed consent signed, they can take it to any vaccinator clinic and any vaccinator can give them the vaccine. Now, the informed consent form is on Clinical Pathways. For those of you that can get Clinical Pathways, we can download it from the ministry website or the IMAC website. So the hassle is at the moment just to make sure the prescriber has written a script, just like a script for any other medication. It's a single, just you write the script and then you take it to the vaccination clinic to get. I hope that's clear enough.
So I guess that means a pharmacist cannot initiate a prescription, can they?
No, at this stage, I understand it's a general practitioner or a nurse practitioner. Now,
Yeah.
this will go away as soon as Pharmac has decided that the third dose for severely immunocompromised is part of the approval process. So this is a temporary measure until, sorry, not Pharmac, MedSafe. It's through the MedSafe approval process. So for the moment, you need to write a script. In the future, we believe that'll be shifting.
So just a question, I think about a third dose is whether someone without a spleen recently diagnosed with TB would fit the criteria. They don't seem to feel that they do, but are obviously keen to get that third dose.
Yeah, I think I'd have to go back and check. I suspect maybe not, but I'll go back and check. But the other thing to let you know, even if you don't fit the third dose, that boosters are going to be, and people like that certainly would be in line for a booster. So be reassured that, you know, there will be an extra vaccine offered to people with a range of medical concerns like that.
And then Robert would like to know what is the believed mechanism for vaccine-related myocarditis?
Yeah, now this, Robert, this would take a lot more conversation really than on this particular now for everybody. But as you're probably all aware, myocarditis is associated with the virus itself. And myocarditis is associated with a lot of viruses. In fact, the more we look, the more we suspect that very low-grade myocarditis is probably quite common post-virus. So you get an inflammatory response, and whether it's immune-mediated or whether it's just a straight inflammatory response to the virus is about what the debate's about at this stage. But it appears to be that the myocarditis we're seeing with the vaccine is probably very like a version of the myocarditis you actually see with the virus itself. You know, and we're happy to share some further interesting papers with you if you're really interested in considering it further, because obviously there's a lot of dialogue around the world internationally at the moment about what is myocarditis. And, you know, what is the community prevalence of myocarditis with people who have routine viruses? It may be that for a long time, people who've had routine viruses get a little bit of chest pain or a bit of shortness of breath and it passes. And nobody realized that they may have been having mild myocarditis. So it's a very interesting topic.
And then Dirk was asking, what is the reason for this vaccine being more reactogenic than our other common vaccines like flu, for example? And does anyone have a theory on that yet?
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways it's not all completely more reactogenic. It's just got a slightly different reactogenicity profile. But I think that this is a vaccine that was designed for older immune systems respond well. And that's why this vaccine is stunningly brilliant at getting older immune systems to get a good, vigorous immune response. And so I don't think it's hugely reactogenic with older immune systems, but one could argue that for younger people who've got a more vigorous immune system, that's why it's so reactogenic. And out of interest, for those of you who know that the dose regime for 5 to 11-year-olds is actually 1/3 of the adult dose regime. So I think that it's a vaccine that's well pitched to midlife and older people, but it's more reactogenic than it needs to be in younger people. And the lower dose in the 5 to 11-year-olds looks more effective.
Great, thanks. Someone else has got a patient who is concerned that the Pfizer vaccine would cause autoimmune problems. Can you please maybe you could role play it how you'd like to respond to that, Nikki?
Thanks very much. Yeah.
I'm very concerned about the Pfizer vaccine because I think it's going to cause really bad immune problems with me.
Yeah, no, it's a completely understandable concern, and one at which the vaccine community looked at very closely, originally in the clinical trials, but since the vaccine has been used internationally, it's now been used in hundreds of millions of doses around the world, and the important safety mechanisms out there in the world have been looking at background rates of many of these important conditions like Bell's palsy, neurological conditions, a whole lot of autoimmune conditions, to look at whether vaccinated people have different rates from unvaccinated, and also to look at whether there's an increase in the background rates of any of these conditions. And it's incredibly reassuring that after hundreds of millions of doses, countries that have put these safety monitoring processes in place, like America, UK, Canada, Europe, have not seen an increase in any of these important autoimmune conditions. Incredibly reassuring. It's very reassuring data. And because of the huge amounts of numbers being used now, we can feel very confident about that. I think the other thing, now I'm dribbling on, so you guys have to cope with this. The other thing that's also useful to say is that, we do know that the international safety monitoring has been working because it has picked up some rare events. And so it has picked up myocarditis. It has picked up the incidence of anaphylaxis post-vaccine. So we do know that the monitoring mechanism is picking up rare events. So that also reassures me that it's not missing other rare events that it's been looking for.
Just a question, do you know anything about, there's a BMJ article about the Pfizer whistleblower? I haven't come
no, sorry, somebody would have to pass that on to us. We just pass it through the EMAC advice people and we can have a look at it for you. I'm not aware of that.
Cool. Okay, well, any more questions, anyone? Or Jess, do you have anything you'd like to share at this point?
I do not have anything more. I
should have a question for you if I prepared properly.
One thing I do want to say is we want to learn from each other. And if there's things that we've said or represented that don't work for anybody listening, I'd really like to hear that too, because I learn through learning with each other. And even though we know a bit of the science, the backgrounds behind our communication, it's how we hone it and how we pitch it to each other. That creates our own trust with each other. And I think in this digital environment, it's even harder because we get less face-to-face and more digital, and how we create trust and effective relationships. So keen to hear from people at any stage. Kia ora.
Cool. And just a reminder that, yes, this session has been recorded. And the one from yesterday is recorded as well and is available on our website now. So if you just go to the covid.immune.org.nz website, you'll see there's a link to webinars in the quick links just on the front page, and you can go to those ones there. Can pharmacists vaccinate children 5 to 11 when it's approved?
If it, my understanding is if a vaccine goes through MedSafe approval, and then it's recommended by the government, by the Ministry of Health, to be given in the national schedule, then authorised vaccinators can then give it. The problem we've got with the third dose, the highly immunocompromised, is that MedSafe is still trying to catch up with its approval dose for the third dose. So that was an exception to the usual rule. So yes, I would expect if we do go for vaccination to 5 to 11-year-olds, then authorised vaccinators who it's within their scope of practice will be able to vaccinate.
And someone was curious about whether under 5s will be considered for vaccination.
Yeah, really interesting, eh? So we're clinical data. We're waiting on clinical data. It's certainly not a given that New Zealand's going to race ahead and vaccinate 5 to 11-year-olds either. The clinical data is just through, and it's just through, and the America has approved it, but no one else yet. So it's always good not to be the first cab off the rank here. We want to see how these vaccines go and their safety profile. So the clinical studies are still underway. I think it's 6 months to 5 years, and I think we'll probably see data on those later in the year.
Cool. Someone who gives COVID vaccinations to people receiving dialysis, do I have to wait for them to finish the procedure, or halfway through the procedure is safe?
It's safe to give the vaccine at any stage through dialysis. The question is how immunocompromised someone is, and is there a better window time when they'll get a better immune response? But you can actually give the vaccine at any stage through the process. But if you think somebody's immune system is going to respond better at a certain time, you might want to pitch your timing to that.
And Bernadette's just been communicating with me saying that yes, once the vaccine is approved for that age, for the 5 to 11s, then yeah, pharmacist COVID vaccinators will be able to give it.
Brilliant.
Robert's asking about how do you respond to requests for vaccine exemption certificates?
Okay, so just to update us, my understanding is the Ministry of Health is very close to finalising a list of who would fit in with a vaccine exemption. There'll be a very small group of people who have a complete intolerance to a Pfizer vaccine, like they've got anaphylaxis. And then there's a slightly larger group of people that may have had a reaction to the first dose, particularly if they had myocarditis in relation to the first dose, but also a group of people who just had quite a severe reaction to the first dose. And it's unclear whether it was or wasn't related to the first dose, but they've some significant disability from that. There's likely to be temporary exemptions for probably up to 6 months for those people to either have time to recover and go ahead and be revaccinated, or to be vaccinated with a different vaccine. And New Zealand is expecting within the next few weeks, I hope, but don't hold me to any timelines, to see a supply of the AstraZeneca vector vaccine in the country soon, which will be an alternative vaccine if people are finding themselves intolerant to the Pfizer vaccine.
Valerie's asking if when 5 to 11-year-olds are due to be vaccinated, will nurses with, I assume that's provisional vaccination, Valerie, will they need further training? I think they do. Nikki, do you remember that? Because that's sort of about them, really. That's a different age group than they've really been trained to deal with.
If Bernadette's online, I'd quite like Bernadette to answer that one. I think
she says that they will be able to give it. Yes, they will. And well,
I thought they had authorization down till below 5.
Yeah, I think it looks like they do.
Obviously, you want a bit of extra training just so you understand what the vaccine is and how you deliver it. But my understanding is they've got.
But I think there will be further training.
Yeah.
Authorized, yes, but we'll do an update. Yeah,
that's it.
That's the answer. Cool. One patient asked me about graphene oxide in Pfizer patient vaccine.
This is another social media beat up. There's no graphene oxide in the Pfizer vaccine. I don't think you need to spend more time on it than that. You can go into the whole reason why somebody came up with the whole trial, but there's not.
Yeah. And Pfizer vaccine apparently has a hazard ratio of 1.4 for hemorrhagic stroke versus stroke risk after catching COVID-19.
Now, I don't think that's quite right. Once again, you can pull out one paper and look at different figures within a paper. But if you look at the very big database, particularly with the US and Australia, and Europe's got it now too, when they look at the background rates, I don't think that's the case at all. I'm very happy to carry that conversation on with somebody, though, if they're concerned about something they're looking at.
Great. Okay, well, look, we've reached 3 minutes past 5. It's been a great session. I'd like to warm thanks to you, Jess, and to Nikki for your time with us today. And I'm sure we'll be back soon with more information for you. So thanks everyone for all your hard work out there on the coalface. We really do appreciate it. And when I close this webinar, there will be a feedback page for you to fill in. So I'd really appreciate your feedback on how useful you found this. So
Kia ora tātou.
thanks again.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Hello,
Theo.
everyone. Thanks.
Anō.
Bye.